The first time I realized my internet tower was about to become the center of a full-scale neighborhood meltdown was the moment I heard a woman screaming about Wi-Fi while standing on my private gravel road waving a clipboard like it was a weapon and threatening to shut down something she clearly did not understand while an ambulance siren echoed faintly in the distance and my phone buzzed with a notification warning that emergency services in the area were experiencing connectivity issues and all of that happened within about 15 seconds, which is funny now, but at the time felt like the opening scene of a disaster movie I never signed up to star in because up until that moment my biggest problem had been birds nesting near the antenna and neighbors asking politely if I could boost the signal a little stronger on weekends so they could stream movies without buffering, and I had built the tower legally on my own land month earlier after fighting with terrible service for years in a semi-rural area where cell towers were sparse and cables were unreliable, and I did everything by the book: permits, zoning, surveys, easements, even consulting a lawyer just to be safe, because I knew exactly the type of people who live in neighborhoods governed by HOAs and how quickly common sense gets replaced by power trips once someone gets a laminated badge and a rulebook thicker than their patience. So when the tower went live and suddenly my home office ran flawlessly and a few nearby homes started asking for access through a private agreement, I thought I had finally solved a long-running problem without hurting anyone and without making noise or eyesores because the structure was slim, professionally installed and tucked behind tree lines barely visible from the road, which is why it shocked me when Karen decided it was a personal attack against her authority and lifestyle because she was the kind of HOA enforcer who treated every new development like a hostile invasion and every neighbor like a potential criminal, and I first met her properly when she marched onto my property uninvited wearing oversized sunglasses and a pastel blazer despite the heat, and announced that my tower violated several community aesthetic principles she could not clearly define, and that I had 72 hours to shut it down or face escalating fines and legal action, and she said it loudly enough for passing neighbors to hear as if volume itself made her correct, and I remember calmly asking her to leave my property and directing her to the official documents I had already submitted to the county and the HOA board months earlier, which she waved away, insisting she had final authority, which was impressive considering she was just a committee member who enjoyed acting like a mayor without a city, and I tried to explain that the tower was critical to my work, that it was compliant, and that it also provided backup connectivity for emergency services in the area through a local mesh agreement, which she scoffed at and mocked by saying if people wanted internet they should move closer to the city and not ruin her view, which was ironic, because her house faced the opposite direction and the tower was not even visible from her backyard. But logic never really slows people like her down, and over the next few weeks she escalated in predictable but exhausting ways, posting notices, taping warning letters to my gate, sending emails filled with bold threats and vague legal language, and rallying a few equally bored neighbors by claiming the tower caused health issues, interference, and declining property values, none of which she could prove, but all of which sounded dramatic enough to spread fear, and every time I responded calmly with documentation, screenshots, approvals, and even offered to attend an HOA meeting to explain everything, she either ignored it or twisted my words, and the situation became a running joke among reasonable neighbors while quietly becoming a nightmare behind the scenes because I could feel something bigger building, like pressure before a storm. And then came the day when the power went out across half the area due to a severe weather system knocking down lines, and the cellular network started failing under load, and my tower switched into backup mode, routing priority traffic exactly as designed, and suddenly my phone started ringing nonstop with messages from people who had mocked the tower days earlier, thanking me for the signal and asking if I could temporarily boost access for their families, and I was in the middle of handling that when I heard shouting outside and looked up to see Karen again, this time without the clipboard but with panic written all over her face because someone in her household needed urgent medical assistance and she could not get a stable connection to call for help because her own service had failed, and the irony hit me so hard it almost felt scripted because this was the same woman who had threatened to shut down The very infrastructure she was now desperately relying on, and as she stood there yelling my name and demanding immediate access like it was something she was entitled to by default, I realized this was no longer just a petty HOA dispute, but a moment where all her bluster and control fantasies collided head-on with reality, and I had to decide how to respond, not just legally but morally, because the tower she wanted gone was now the only thing standing between chaos and help arriving on time. And that realization changed the entire tone of the conflict in an instant, because from that moment on nothing was about aesthetics or rules or power anymore. It was about consequences and the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the things people try hardest to destroy are the very things they end up needing most. And standing there listening to her shout while my system logs updated in real time showing emergency packets routing through my network, I knew this was only the beginning of a much larger story that would test patience, expose hypocrisy, and prove once and for all that control without understanding is a dangerous thing, especially when lives are on the line. The hours after that first confrontation passed in a strange blur where adrenaline refused to fade, and every small sound felt louder than it should have, because once Karen stormed away after getting the connection she demanded, she did not suddenly become reasonable or grateful the way a normal person might have, but instead she transformed that emergency into a weapon, and by the next morning my inbox was filled with messages from the HOA board, CC lists, legal-sounding warnings, and neighborhood group emails where she framed the situation as proof that my tower was a dangerous, uncontrolled utility that placed the entire community at risk. And the speed with which she rewrote reality was impressive in a dark way, because in her version she was the hero who had bravely intervened during a crisis, while I was the reckless individual running an unauthorized network that could collapse at any moment. And she claimed that if she had not acted decisively, things could have ended far worse, which conveniently ignored the fact that the system worked exactly as designed, and without it there would have been no connection at all. And I remember sitting at my desk that morning staring at the screen, feeling that familiar frustration that comes from dealing with someone who never argues facts but instead argues feelings and authority, and I knew from experience that trying to reason with her directly would only fuel her, so I shifted into preparation mode, because when someone like Karen feels threatened, they escalate, not logically but theatrically. And the next HOA meeting was scheduled for that weekend, which meant I had just enough time to gather every document, log, and approval related to the tower, and I printed everything out, not because I expected everyone to read it, but because the physical presence of facts sometimes has more weight than digital files, especially in rooms full of people who respond more to tone than truth. And while I worked through that, Karen continued her campaign by knocking on doors, telling neighbors the tower emitted radiation and interfered with emergency communications, which was ironic considering it had just supported one, and she even went as far as placing a large temporary notice board near the community entrance warning about unapproved infrastructure, which the county later forced her to remove, but not before half the neighborhood had already seen it and started whispering. And what made it worse was the way she weaponized concern by pretending to care deeply about safety while clearly enjoying the attention and the sense of power that came with being the loudest voice. And I could tell this was personal for her, because the tower represented something she could not control, and that was unacceptable in her worldview. And when the HOA meeting finally arrived, the room was packed far more than usual, with people sitting on folding chairs lining the walls, and Karen took the floor, almost immediately launching into a dramatic retelling of the emergency, complete with exaggerated pauses and emotional language, describing how terrifying it had been to be unable to reach help, and how dangerous it was that a private individual controlled critical infrastructure. And I listened quietly while she spoke, knowing that interrupting would only make her look more righteous, and when she finished she demanded immediate suspension of the tower until a full review could be conducted, which sounded reasonable on the surface until you realized that shutting it down would remove the very backup system that had just proven its value, and when it was finally my turn I stood up slowly and spoke calmly, laying out the timeline of permits, approvals, and agreements, including the fact that the tower was registered with the county as a private communication structure and had been inspected and cleared weeks before it ever went live, and I explained in simple terms how it functioned, how it prioritized traffic during outages, and how it had already prevented communication failures in the area. And as I spoke I could see the mood in the room shifting, because facts have a way of doing that when they are delivered without anger and supported by evidence. And when I mentioned that Karen herself had used the system during the emergency and that logs clearly showed her household receiving priority bandwidth, at that exact moment a murmur went through the crowd and her face tightened, because she knew exactly where this was going, and she tried to interrupt, accusing me of violating privacy, which I addressed immediately by explaining that no personal data was accessed, only anonymized routing information, which is standard practice and legal. And the board members started asking questions, real questions, not the performative kind, and suddenly Karen was no longer directing the conversation, she was reacting to it, and that loss of control rattled her because she doubled down, claiming that even if everything was technically legal it still violated the spirit of the community, which is always the last refuge when rules and facts fail. And I responded by asking the board to consider whether the spirit of the community included reliable emergency communication, especially in a rural area prone to outages, and whether removing that safety net served anyone other than personal grudges. And by the time the meeting ended no decision had been made, but it was clear that the board was not going to rubber stamp her demands, and that infuriated her, because as people filtered out I overheard her telling anyone who would listen that this was not over and that she would take the matter further if she had to. And I knew she meant it, because people like her do not retreat quietly, they regroup and escalate. And as I drove home that night past the dark silhouette of the tower against the sky, I could feel the tension settling into something heavier, because now the conflict had moved from petty enforcement to something more dangerous. A battle over narrative control, where facts were ammunition and emergencies were bargaining chips. And I realized that whatever came next would not be small or simple, because Karen had tasted both humiliation and dependence in the same moment, and that combination is the most volatile of all. By the time the next week rolled around it was obvious Karen had decided subtlety was no longer useful, because instead of quietly licking her wounds after the HOA meeting she launched into what I can only describe as a full-scale harassment campaign dressed up as civic duty. And it started with daily emails, not just to me but to the entire board, copied to half the neighborhood, filled with long rambling accusations that shifted slightly each time so they could never be pinned down. She claimed the tower caused interference with baby monitors, then weather radios, then garage door openers, and when none of that gained traction she pivoted to claiming it was a commercial operation disguised as residential infrastructure, which was amusing considering she had personally benefited from it during an emergency. And what made it exhausting was not just the volume of noise but the way she constantly demanded immediate action, while refusing to acknowledge any response that did not agree with her. And meanwhile I kept working quietly behind the scenes, because I knew that people like her tend to overplay their hand when they think pressure alone will force compliance. And I started documenting everything: timestamps, screenshots, recordings of conversations where she threatened fines she had no authority to issue, and notes from neighbors who had been approached and pressured to complain. And several of them reached out to me directly, apologizing and explaining that they had felt intimidated because Karen had a reputation for dragging people into endless disputes if they crossed her. And hearing that confirmed something I had suspected all along, that this was not about safety or aesthetics but about control and the illusion of power. And as I compiled everything I also reached out to the county communications office and emergency services liaison to make sure all agreements were up to date, and to notify them that there might be attempts to interfere with the tower and their response was immediate and firm because from their perspective the tower was a private asset that enhanced regional resilience, and any attempt to shut it down without cause would raise serious concerns, and that reassurance helped, but it did not stop Karen from escalating further, because a few days later I came home to find a bright orange notice taped to my gate claiming the tower was under review and warning of potential disconnection, and the paper looked official at a glance, but when I read it closely, it was obvious she had printed it herself, complete with vague references and no legitimate authority listed, and that was the moment I realized she was willing to impersonate regulatory action to get her way, which crossed a line, and I immediately photographed it, documented the time, and contacted the HOA board and the county, and while the board responded with a cautious request for her to stop, the county was far less patient, because impersonating official notices is not taken lightly, and when Karen found out she had triggered external attention, she tried to backpedal by claiming it was merely informational, but the damage was done because now people were starting to question her credibility openly, and that is when she pivoted again, this time targeting me personally by spreading rumors that I was charging neighbors exorbitant fees for access and spying on traffic, both of which were demonstrably false and easily disproven, but rumors have a way of lingering even when they are wrong, and the emotional toll of knowing someone is actively trying to damage your reputation cannot be overstated, especially when you have done nothing wrong and are simply trying to mind your own business and keep things running smoothly. And there were moments late at night when I wondered if it would be easier to shut the whole thing down just to make it stop, but every time that thought surfaced I remembered the outage and the sirens and the fact that the tower had already proven its value, and that giving in would not just reward bad behavior but remove something genuinely beneficial. And as if on cue, the situation took another turn when a severe storm warning was issued for the area, with forecasts predicting flooding and extended power loss, and suddenly the same neighbors who had been quiet or skeptical started asking questions about backup connectivity and emergency access, and Karen must have felt the shift because she appeared at my property again, this time with a forced politeness that barely concealed her anger, and she suggested we come to a compromise where I would temporarily disable the tower during normal conditions and only activate it during declared emergencies, which made no technical sense and would have undermined its entire purpose. And when I calmly explained that, she snapped, accusing me of being selfish and power-hungry, which was rich coming from someone who had tried to fake authority and bully an entire neighborhood, and when I refused, she stormed off, declaring that she would take this to higher authorities. And that was when I received the call from the county later that afternoon informing me that they had received a complaint alleging unsafe operation and requesting an inspection, and while they assured me it was routine and likely unfounded, the timing was too perfect to be coincidence, and the inspection itself went smoothly because everything was compliant and properly maintained, and the inspector even commented on how clean and well documented the setup was. But the mere fact that Karen had forced that process showed how far she was willing to go, and as the storm clouds gathered both literally and figuratively, I could feel the conflict tightening around a central truth that no amount of intimidation could change, which was that the tower existed because the area needed it, and the more Karen fought that reality, the more isolated she became, and yet, instead of recognizing that, she doubled down again because people like her see resistance not as a signal to reflect but as a challenge to conquer, and I knew deep down that the approaching storm was going to test everyone involved, and that when the lights went out and the phones stopped working, the difference between control and cooperation would become painfully clear, and whatever happened next would expose exactly who had been acting in the community interest and who had only been acting in their own. The storm did not arrive dramatically all at once the way movies like to show it, but instead crept in with a steady oppressive weight that made the air feel thick and restless, and by late afternoon the sky had turned the kind of dull gray that flattens sound and color and makes even familiar places feel uneasy, and I had already taken precautions, checking the tower power systems, verifying the battery backups, and confirming routing priorities, because experience had taught me that when systems are stressed, human behavior often follows, and sure enough, by early evening the power flickered once, twice, and then went out entirely across most of the area, and within minutes the cellular network became unreliable as everyone tried to check on loved ones and monitor weather updates, and the tower shifted smoothly into its emergency profile, doing exactly what it was designed to do, and at first things were quiet, almost eerily so, until the first messages started coming in, neighbors asking if the signal was up, confirming they could still make calls, thanking me for setting it up, and I responded briefly because I was monitoring system health and storm alerts, and then just as the rain intensified and wind began pushing against the windows, there was a loud knock at my door, followed by Karen's unmistakable voice demanding to be let in, and when I opened the door she stood there soaked and visibly shaken, no clipboard, no smug smile, just raw anxiety because the storm had knocked a tree down near her property, blocking access, and her household had lost all connectivity except for the faint signal from my tower, and someone with her was injured from a fall and needed help, and the shift in her demeanor was so abrupt it almost felt surreal, because this was the same person who had spent weeks trying to dismantle the system she was now relying on, and I did not hesitate, because emergencies strip away pettiness, and whatever our conflict was, it did not outweigh someone's safety, and I helped her get connected and contacted emergency services and coordinated with responders who confirmed they were receiving clear data and location information thanks to the tower, and while all of that was happening, Karen stood silently in the corner watching everything unfold, and I could tell that the reality of the situation was sinking in, because for the first time she was not in control and not performing for an audience. She was just a person caught in circumstances she could not bully her way out of. And when responders arrived despite the storm and handled the situation efficiently, she left without saying much, and I thought maybe, just maybe, that experience would have humbled her or at least forced some self-awareness, but I underestimated the depth of her denial, because the next morning, once the storm had passed and power began returning in stages, she was already back at it, this time spinning the narrative yet again by telling neighbors that the emergency proved her point, that private infrastructure was dangerous because it placed too much responsibility in the hands of one individual, and she conveniently omitted the part where it had worked flawlessly and made a difficult situation manageable, and when I heard that she was framing it that way, I felt a mix of disbelief and exhaustion, because there was something almost tragic about how determined she was to avoid acknowledging the obvious, and what made it worse was that she began pushing for an emergency HOA vote to suspend the tower pending further review, claiming that the stress of the storm highlighted unacceptable risks, and she framed it as a safety measure, knowing that fear was a powerful motivator, and the board was suddenly under pressure because storms have a way of rattling people and making them more receptive to simplistic solutions, and I realized that this was the turning point, because if she succeeded now, she would set a precedent that authority could be seized through panic rather than reason, and I spent that day speaking to board members one by one, calmly reminding them of the facts, the inspections, the approvals, the real-world performance during the storm, and I could tell that some of them were torn not because they doubted the tower but because they feared backlash from someone as relentless as Karen, and that fear is exactly what she thrived on. And later that evening a notice went out announcing an emergency HOA meeting to discuss temporary suspension of the tower, and I knew Karen had orchestrated it because she had always been adept at forcing urgency when it suited her, and as I prepared for that meeting I felt a strange sense of clarity, because the storm had stripped the situation down to its core and revealed the truth in a way no argument ever could, and I gathered logs, timestamps, service records, and messages from neighbors who had relied on the connection during the outage, and I knew that this was no longer just about defending myself but about drawing a line between responsible use of authority and reckless abuse of it, and when the meeting convened the room was tense, filled with people still shaken from the storm, and Karen wasted no time launching into an emotional appeal describing fear, chaos, and uncertainty, and framing herself as someone trying to protect the community from unknown risks, and when she finished I stood and spoke, not with anger but with measured urgency, explaining what had actually happened during the storm, how the tower had supported emergency communication, how responders had confirmed its value, and how shutting it down would leave the community more vulnerable, not less, and I could see faces change, as people connected their own experiences to what I was saying, and when several neighbors spoke up to share how they had used the connection to check on family and coordinate help, the narrative Karen had built began to crack, and she tried to interrupt and redirect, but the room no longer responded to her the way it once had, and that was the moment I realized that storms do more than knock out power. They expose what is solid and what is hollow, and while Karen continued to push her agenda with increasing desperation, the foundation of her authority was eroding, because people had seen firsthand that control without competence offers no protection, and that sometimes the quiet work done in preparation matters far more than loud declarations made in fear. By the time the emergency meeting ended, it was clear that Karen had not gotten the decisive victory she wanted, but it was equally clear she was not done, because the way she left the room, stiff-backed, tight-jawed, and already whispering to a small cluster of people, told me she was shifting strategies rather than surrendering, and over the next few days that shift became obvious when, instead of loud public confrontations, she began operating quietly, and that was almost more unsettling because silence from someone like her usually means preparation, and I soon learned through a board member, who felt increasingly uncomfortable with her behavior, that Karen had started contacting outside lawyers and regulatory offices, fishing for anything she could use to force the tower offline, and she framed every inquiry as a concerned citizen report, carefully avoiding lies she could be held accountable for while still implying danger and misconduct, and this time, instead of directly attacking me, she focused on the idea that no single resident should control something that others had come to depend on, which sounded reasonable until you remembered that she had been the one trying to eliminate it entirely just weeks earlier, and the contradiction did not seem to bother her at all, because in her mind consistency was less important than leverage, and as these efforts unfolded, the atmosphere in the neighborhood grew tense, because people could feel that something was brewing, and they did not like being caught in the middle, and several neighbors approached me privately to express support but also fear, because Karen had a long memory and a habit of making life difficult for anyone she perceived as disloyal, and hearing that hardened my resolve, because intimidation thrives when people retreat into silence, and I decided that transparency was the only way forward, so I sent out a detailed but calm message to the community explaining exactly what the tower was, what it did, how it was regulated, and why it mattered, and I included statements from county officials and emergency responders confirming its compliance and value, and I expected backlash, but instead what I received was something closer to relief, because people were tired of rumors and appreciated having clear information, and that shift in sentiment infuriated Karen, because she could no longer control the narrative through fear alone, and that was when she made her boldest move yet by attempting to push through emotion within the HOA to seize temporary operational control of the tower under the guise of safety oversight, which was legally absurd because the HOA had no authority over private infrastructure, but she presented it with enough confidence and urgency that a few board members initially wavered, and when I was notified of the proposal, I realized this was the moment everything could either collapse into chaos or finally reach a breaking point, and I contacted my lawyer, who had been advising quietly from the sidelines, and within hours we had drafted a formal response outlining the legal boundaries Karen was attempting to cross and the potential liability the HOA would face if they tried to interfere with permitted equipment, and when that response was delivered to the board, the tone of the conversation shifted dramatically, because suddenly the abstract fight Karen had been waging carried concrete consequences, and board members who had tolerated her theatrics out of convenience began distancing themselves because no one wanted to be personally responsible for a lawsuit, and Karen reacted to this by accusing me of threatening the community, which was ironic considering I was the one urging caution and legality while she was pushing reckless action, and at the next board gathering, which was not officially a meeting but more of a tense discussion, the divide became impossible to ignore because people spoke openly about feeling manipulated and pressured, and one board member finally voiced what many had been thinking, which was that Karen seemed more interested in control than solutions, and that statement hit her like a slap, because her response was not denial but outrage, and she launched into a rant about disrespect and authority that only reinforced the point. And watching that unfold, I felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness, because it was clear she could not step back even when it was obvious she was losing ground. And as if to underline that reality, the county sent a formal letter to the HOA clarifying that any attempt to interfere with the tower would be considered unauthorized and subject to penalties, and when Karen saw that letter she tried to spin it as a temporary opinion that could be challenged, but her voice lacked conviction, and for the first time I saw uncertainty flicker across her face, because she had pushed herself into a corner where every option led to exposure, and that was when she made one last desperate attempt to regain control by appealing directly to emotion rather than authority, by going door to door telling people she felt unsafe and unheard, and that she was being bullied by technical jargon and legal threats. And some people listened sympathetically because no one likes conflict, but many more saw through it because they had watched her behavior for weeks and recognized the pattern, and that erosion of support was perhaps the hardest thing for her to accept, because power trips only work when others play along. And as the days passed, it became increasingly clear that the conflict was no longer about the tower at all, but about whether the community would continue to enable someone who thrived on dominance at the expense of reason. And I knew that the end was approaching, not because Karen was backing down, but because the systems she relied on, fear, silence, and confusion, had stopped working. And when someone like her loses those tools, all that remains is desperation, and that is when mistakes are made. And standing there one evening watching the tower lights blink steadily against the darkening sky, I understood that whatever came next would finally force a reckoning, not just for her but for the entire neighborhood, because you cannot pretend something is dangerous after it has repeatedly kept you safe, and you cannot claim to protect a community while actively undermining the very structures that support it. And soon everyone would have to choose which version of the truth they were willing to live with. The breaking point arrived not with another meeting or letter, but with an incident so public and undeniable that there was no way left to spin it, because Karen finally crossed from harassment into action, and did it in broad daylight, when she decided to test her authority one last time by attempting to physically interfere with the tower. And it happened on a quiet afternoon, when most people were home because remote work had become common and connectivity mattered more than ever, and I was inside, monitoring routine diagnostics, when I noticed a sudden fluctuation in signal strength that did not match weather or load patterns, and within seconds alerts began firing indicating deliberate interference. And I stepped outside to see Karen standing near the secured perimeter with two men I had never seen before, gesturing wildly toward the equipment and holding a stack of papers as if they were a badge of legitimacy. And the shock was not just that she was there, but that she looked confident, almost triumphant, like someone who believed she had finally found the move that would end the game. And when I approached, she announced loudly enough for nearby houses to hear that the HOA had authorized a temporary safety shutdown pending further review, and that she had brought contractors to assess the structure, which was a blatant lie, because no such authorization existed. And when I told her to leave immediately, she accused me of obstructing an official safety action, and one of the men began reaching toward the equipment until I ordered him to stop, and informed all of them that they were trespassing and that law enforcement was already on the way, because I had activated security protocols the moment the interference began. And that was when her confidence cracked, just slightly, because she had not expected consequences to arrive so quickly, and neighbors started coming out of their homes, drawn by the raised voices and the unusual sight of strangers near critical infrastructure. And Karen tried to rally them on the spot, claiming she was protecting the community from a dangerous installation, but before she could gain momentum, patrol vehicles arrived along with a county official who had been alerted due to the interference flags, and the scene shifted instantly, because authority that actually mattered has a way of doing that. And as officers separated everyone and asked questions, Karen attempted to dominate the conversation as usual, but this time her words collided with documented reality because I provided permits approvals correspondence and system logs showing the exact moment interference began, and the county official confirmed that no HOA had the authority to authorize what she was claiming, and when the contractors admitted they had been told this was an approved inspection, the situation escalated rapidly because impersonation and unauthorized interference with communications infrastructure are not treated lightly, and Karen's tone changed from commanding to defensive as she tried to reframe the incident as a misunderstanding, but there was no ambiguity left because multiple witnesses had heard her declarations and security footage captured the entire interaction, and as the officers spoke quietly among themselves, I watched the realization sink in across the faces of the neighbors gathered nearby, because this was no longer a dispute of opinions or personalities. It was a clear demonstration of recklessness and abuse of power, and when Karen was informed that her actions were being formally documented and that further attempts to interfere could result in serious legal consequences, she reacted not with remorse but with outrage, accusing everyone present of conspiring against her, and that outburst only reinforced what many had already concluded, and by the time the scene cleared, the story had spread through the neighborhood faster than any email ever could because people had seen it with their own eyes, and later that evening messages began circulating expressing shock and concern, and even those who had previously stayed neutral began speaking openly about feeling relieved that someone had finally drawn a line, and the HOA board responded swiftly, issuing a statement clarifying that Karen had acted without authorization and that her role was under review, and that announcement marked a turning point because for the first time the institution she had used as a shield began distancing itself from her, and she responded predictably by attempting to portray herself as a martyr, claiming she had been set up and silenced for caring too much, but the narrative no longer held because the evidence was too concrete and the consequences too visible, and as days passed and formal notices were issued, the weight of what she had done became unavoidable, and neighbors, who once feared crossing her, now felt empowered to speak honestly about their experiences and patterns of intimidation, and watching that collective release was strange and sobering because it revealed how much tension had been quietly tolerated for years, and as for the tower, it continued to operate steadily, its presence now less controversial and more appreciated because people understood what had almost been lost, and standing there one night listening to the hum of equipment and the distant sounds of a community settling back into something resembling normalcy, I felt a mix of relief and responsibility because this chapter of the conflict had not been won through clever arguments or dramatic speeches but through patience, documentation, and the simple truth that systems built to serve people eventually reveal who is acting in good faith and who is not. And although I knew the story was not quite finished because Karen was not someone who accepted defeat gracefully, the illusion she had relied on had shattered in full view of everyone, and from that moment forward nothing she said would ever carry the same weight again. The fallout from that afternoon spread through the neighborhood like a slow-moving but irreversible wave, because once people saw the limits of Karen's authority exposed, they began reassessing every interaction they had ever had with her, and the stories started coming out quietly at first, then with growing confidence, neighbors sharing how they had been fined, arbitrarily threatened over trivial issues, pressured into compliance, or publicly shamed for questioning her interpretations of the rules. And what struck me most was how similar the patterns were, because she always framed her actions as protection while isolating anyone who resisted, and as those conversations unfolded, the HOA board found itself under scrutiny as well, because people began asking how this behavior had been tolerated for so long and why no safeguards had existed to stop a single individual from exerting such disproportionate influence. And that shift in focus mattered because it transformed the situation from a personal conflict into a systemic reckoning, and Karen sensed it because she abruptly changed tactics yet again, this time presenting herself as a victim of targeted harassment and claiming that she was being unfairly singled out for doing her job, and she sent lengthy emails filled with emotional language about stress, anxiety, and betrayal, but the tone rang hollow to many because it arrived only after her actions had been publicly challenged and documented, and the board responded cautiously. initiating a formal review of her conduct, which was something that had never happened before, and that process alone marked a significant change, because it acknowledged that authority within the community was not absolute, and that accountability applied even to those who wielded it most aggressively. And during that period Karen oscillated between attempts at reconciliation and bursts of anger, and she approached me once, unexpectedly near the mailbox, offering a strained version of an apology that focused more on how the situation had affected her than on the harm she had caused, and when I responded politely but without conceding any wrongdoing, she bristled and accused me of enjoying her downfall, which missed the point entirely, because this was never about winning but about stopping behavior that endangered others and eroded trust, and that distinction seemed impossible for her to grasp. And as the review progressed, more documentation surfaced, including emails she had sent to contractors, misrepresenting her authority, and messages where she threatened board members with public backlash if they did not support her initiatives, and each revelation chipped away at the persona she had cultivated and replaced it with a clearer picture of someone who equated control with purpose and felt personally threatened by any structure she could not dominate. And meanwhile, life in the neighborhood began to shift subtly but noticeably, because people felt safer speaking openly, and collaboration replace tension in small, everyday ways, neighbors sharing resources, checking on one another during minor outages, and acknowledging the tower not as a symbol of conflict but as a shared safety net. And that change was perhaps the most telling outcome, because it demonstrated how much Karen's presence had stifled cooperation, and when the board finally convened to discuss the findings, the atmosphere was sober and deliberate, and while the details were not publicly shared, it became clear that the board was moving toward formal action to limit her role and authority. And when that decision was announced, Karen reacted with fury, accusing everyone involved of conspiring against her and threatening legal action. But those threats no longer carried the same weight, because people had learned the difference between bluster and substance, and legal counsel quickly shut down any claims that lacked merit. And watching her unravel was uncomfortable, not because she did not deserve consequences, but because it highlighted how completely her identity had become entangled with the power she wielded, and without it she seemed adrift, grasping for relevance and control in increasingly erratic ways. And there were moments when I wondered if things could have gone differently if she had chosen humility earlier, but hindsight does not change outcomes, and as the weeks passed, the board implemented new policies to prevent similar abuses, including clearer limits on individual authority and improve oversight, which were long overdue. And as for me, I found myself unexpectedly cast as a reference point for transparency and calm decision making, which was ironic considering I had only ever wanted reliable internet and a quiet life. And while I appreciated the trust, it also reinforced the responsibility that comes with maintaining systems others depend on. And Karen's influence continued to fade as her appeals failed, and her credibility diminished, and eventually she stopped attending meetings, altogether retreating into a self-imposed isolation that contrasted sharply with the dominance she once displayed. And the absence of her constant pressure allowed the community to breathe in a way it had not for years. And as I reflected on everything that had unfolded, I realized that the true conflict had never been about a tower or even about rules, but about fear of losing control, fear of change, fear of being irrelevant, and that fear had driven her to make increasingly destructive choices. And now, as the situation settled into a fragile but genuine stability, it was clear that the final chapter was approaching, not with a dramatic showdown, but with the quiet understanding that accountability had reshaped the balance of power and restored a sense of fairness and trust that had been missing for far too long. By the time everything finally settled, the neighborhood felt different in a way that was hard to explain unless you had lived through the tension, because it was not just quieter but lighter, as if a constant pressure had been lifted and people were no longer bracing themselves for the next confrontation or warning notice. And the tower still stood exactly where it always had, humming steadily, doing its job, without drama, which somehow felt symbolic, because the thing that had caused so much conflict had never actually changed, only the behavior around it had, and Karen became a kind of ghost in the community, her presence reduced to occasional sightings at a distance and brief appearances that lacked the authority she once wielded, and eventually word spread that she had resigned from all HOA involvement, citing personal reasons, which was a graceful way of saying she no longer had the influence to continue. And when that news reached most people, the reaction was not celebration but relief. Because no one wanted a villain, they just wanted peace and stability, and the board moved forward with reforms that emphasized shared decision-making, transparency, and limits on individual power, and those changes did more than prevent another Karen. They rebuilt trust in a system that had quietly failed for years, and for my part, one continued maintaining the tower with the same care and documentation as always, because I understood, now more than ever, that when people depend on something even indirectly, the responsibility is real and must be treated as such. And there were moments when neighbors stopped by simply to say thank you, not in a dramatic way, but casually, as if acknowledging something that had become part of everyday life, and those small gestures meant more than any apology could, because they represented a return to normalcy and cooperation. And occasionally I would hear updates about Karen through secondhand conversations, how she blamed everyone but herself, how she insisted she had been misunderstood, and how she struggled to accept that her actions had consequences. And while there was a temptation to feel vindicated, I mostly felt a quiet sadness, because it was clear that she had built her identity around control, and when that collapsed there was nothing underneath to soften the fall. And that realization stayed with me, because it underscored how easily authority can become a substitute for purpose if someone lets it. And as months passed, the memory of the conflict began to fade into a story people referenced occasionally when discussing why certain rules existed or why oversight mattered, and the tower became unremarkable again, which was perhaps the greatest compliment, because it meant it had returned to its intended role as infrastructure rather than symbol. And sometimes during storms, when the power flickered and the system shifted seamlessly into backup mode, I would think back to that first emergency and how close everything had come to unraveling because of one person's refusal to understand what she was trying to destroy. And I realized that the true lesson of the whole ordeal was not about standing up to bullies or winning disputes, but about patience, preparation, and the power of letting reality speak louder than outrage. And the community had learned that cooperation outperforms control every time, and that safety comes not from dominance but from systems built on trust and accountability. And on a personal level, the experience changed how I approached conflict, because it reinforced the idea that staying calm and grounded in facts is not weakness but strategy, and that the most effective response to entitlement is not escalation but consistency. And when I look at the tower now silhouetted against the evening sky, I no longer see a source of stress or triumph, but a reminder that the things that quietly support our lives often go unnoticed until someone tries to take them away, and that when that happens, the choice between fear-driven authority and collective responsibility becomes unavoidable. And in this case, at least, the community chose wisely and moved forward stronger for it, leaving behind a cautionary tale about power misused, and the undeniable truth that sometimes the very thing someone tries hardest to control ends up teaching them the most painful lesson of all.